Want to be able to play new release games like Starfield a few hours early, or play games not yet available in your region like Blue Protocol or the new Call of Duty Warzone mobile? Well, this video's sponsor, Expressvpn, can make all that and more happen. Click the link below to check it out or stick around to the end of the video to learn more.
Remnant 2 from the developer Gunfire Games is their follow-up to the well-received Remnant from the Ashes, an ambitious game combining the hallmarks of the Souls-like genre with third-person shooter combat and procedural dungeons. I have a confession. I did not play that game, not for any particular reason. I think it just didn't launch at the right time for me, to be honest, and I never got around to looping back to it. Regardless, I was excited for the sequel. I was interested in the first game, don't get me wrong, but with new additions to the combat and expanding the procedural elements alongside a visual facelift, I felt this was the perfect time to dive in and see what all the fuss was about. So, I've played about 30 hours of Remnant 2 now, completed the campaign at about hour 25 and then went back and did some other stuff. Played mostly co-op with a friend of mine, but also played around solo for a bit. I'll try to be as spoiler-free as possible here. As far as story goes, I won't show any cutscenes from the main story outside of the prologue. I'll only show gameplay from 3 of the worlds, and I also won't be showing off any of the major bosses, just a few mini-bosses. Now, I was going into this expecting just a fun little AA co-op romp. A standard third-person shooter, gunning down room after room of enemies through procedurally generated corridors, with a little flourish of that Souls-like difficulty. What I did not see coming was a game with a diverse range of worlds to explore, with jaw-dropping visuals rivaling the best this industry has to offer. These lands filled to the brim with an abundance of character interactions, secrets, and puzzles that handsomely reward your curiosity. This is a game with visceral combat and fantastic boss encounters, propped up by some seriously flexible buildcraft. Finally, tying all this together is a very compelling gameplay loop as a result of the game's rather novel procedural systems that enhance replayability tenfold. It's not a flawless game, there's still a few blemishes when it comes to the main story and item economy, for example, but overall I can confidently say that Remnant 2 is one of the best games I've played this year, in a year already chock full of excellent titles. I seriously can't stop thinking about this game, and even though I've completed the campaign, even when this review is out the door, I cannot wait to re-roll and do it all over again, because goddamn, this game fucking slaps. So your journey begins here, in character creation. Your customization options here are limited, but for what it's worth, I think the character models actually look quite good. A huge upgrade over the first game, that's for sure. You do get to pick a voice, as your character does indeed talk, so make sure to pick a voice you like, because you're going to hear it a lot throughout both gameplay and cutscenes. Next, you'll pick a difficulty. Yes, this game has difficulties, despite being a Souls-like, and after that, you're straight into the game. We load in, and I open the settings menu. Nothing fancy, but it's sufficient. I turned motion blur off. The implementation of motion blur here isn't that bad, to be fair, but this is just my personal preference. The game honestly ran great for me on an RTX 3080 with an i7 at max settings, DSSR enabled. The game never dropped below 60, or if it did, very rarely. I did see other reviewers reporting performance issues though, and Digital Foundry's video does show consoles struggling with that as well, so I highly encourage you check out other videos on that matter if that's a concern for you, as I just don't have the equipment to do much further testing. Jumping into the story now, and I'm sure you're asking the question. The game has a 2 in the title. Do I need to have played Remnant 1 to understand what's going on here in Remnant 2? Honestly, no, not at all. The plot is pretty straightforward. An alien species known as the Root has infected the world, its corruption killing most of the population. You and your friend are wandering about the wasteland in search of a safe haven. You run into some survivors who take you to that safe haven known as Ward 13, and this place houses a big red crystal called the World Stone. The World Stone is a gateway to, well, you know, other worlds, and you must use it to find the source of the Root, ending it once and for all. So to be honest, I found the overarching plot regarding the route was nothing to write home about. There are only a couple characters you'll interact with here. None of them you'll find yourself particularly invested in. Don't go into this expecting some kind of, AAA story with, crazy twists or interesting character moments. That core story is basically like half a dozen cutscenes all up, and I found the ending quite lackluster as well, leaving a lot of questions left unanswered. But thankfully, that's not the only story going on here. While there is that central golden path, this game has an interesting campaign structure where the order in which you visit these worlds and your journey within them is procedurally generated. I'll avoid sharing too many details because I think it's worth going in totally blind, but here you'll encounter all manner of peculiar characters that'll really immerse you in the drama and mysteries of these lands. It's the kind of storytelling you're used to from the Souls-like genre. These otherworldly characters provide some light exposition, but the environments and hidden journals deliver the bulk of the world building, all while leaving just enough loose threads to spark your intrigue. These interactions also serve a gameplay purpose, because how your journey unfolds here is also largely determined by you, the player. This is when I knew this game was going to be something special. When you talk to these characters, you're often given many dialogue options, and I found myself absolutely agonizing over these. Just saying the wrong thing to a character could result in your encounter suddenly becoming a boss fight. Say the right thing to them, and they may offer you a new weapon as thanks for your respect. The thing is, neither of these outcomes feels like the correct option. Both are just as compelling. Both end up being rewarding one way or another. Elden Ring had similar systems regarding character interactions and quest lines, but they're far less obtuse here. They feel more intuitive. Quest items clearly state their significance, and you even have a quest log of sorts. So while the main narrative left a lot to be desired, I really enjoyed the stories of these worlds, especially given how much player agency is involved. The best part is, I haven't even seen it all. There's only like one world where I've played through both campaigns, but even on that world, there's quite a number of bosses, encounters, and puzzles that I've seen from other people's playthroughs that I never came across. See, a core part of the gameplay loop is that when you complete a world's main campaign, you'll unlock it in adventure mode, which is separate from your ongoing campaign. This allows you to select a world and difficulty, then jump back in and rediscover the zone with a different campaign and layout. You can re-roll this world as many times as you like until you get the desired result. There's just a staggering amount of replay value here, and I simply cannot wait to explore those alternate outcomes. Alright, so I just have one question for the good folks at Gunfire Games. What are you feeding your artists? This game is stunning. Unless I'm mistaken, I believe this is the first game aside from Fortnite to be running on Unreal Engine 5. And you can really tell the artists over at Gunfire have taken full advantage of that. UE5's flagship nanite tech allows meshes to be extremely high fidelity without tanking performance. Details that would otherwise be faked through textures and other methods are instead just part of the geometry. It's why all these bricks and rubble and rock can look so hyper-realistic and high detail even up close. Ground clutter is plentiful, vegetation is dense. The lighting and the visual diversity of environments here is just spectacular. Light shafts spill in from above in crumbled temples, foliage at night lit up by the roots' bioluminescence, scarlet red overgrowth atop floating islands illuminated by a blood moon's rays. These examples were from just one world, believe it or not. Each of the other worlds have just as many distinct biomes and locations, keeping things fresh the whole way through. One of them made me feel like I was transported into a Resident Evil game. A decrepit village with pitchfork-wielding citizens, complete with chainsaw men and a spooky house. And let me tell you, I'm glad I played this game co-op, because I would have noped out of the game then and there. But yeah, every new zone I discovered, I had to take a moment to soak it all in, mouth agape. My experience can be summarized by the word, whoa. Every vista, boss arena, building interior, just whoa. I don't know if this video is doing it justice, but I was genuinely taken aback by how good these environments look. Absolutely standing toe to toe with recent AAA outings like God of War Ragnarok and Horizon Forbidden West. I think because of its procedural nature, you don't get as many of those iconic, awe-inspiring landmarks as you see in those titles I mentioned, but at least in terms of raw graphical fidelity, Remnant 2 is punching well above its weight. You may think that the procedurally generated layouts would tire after a while once you've seen the same tile set repeated over and over. This was definitely a concern of mine early on, as we started in a place called Narud, which was a very open zone that required a lot of aimless backtracking through similar looking areas to find the thing we needed to progress. That was one specific case though. The other worlds are more linear, easier to navigate, and I found that by the time that location had overstayed its welcome, you're then shuttled into a whole new zone. Those handcrafted sections do still exist though. It's not just procedurally generated shooting galleries. The general layout of the levels and dungeons are randomized, but between those are some very well-crafted combat arenas, set-piece moments, and labyrinths that often house some sort of puzzle. And I mean, let's talk about the puzzles, because I can safely say I was not walking into this game expecting to engage my brain as much as I did. Don't worry, I won't spoil the solutions to any of these. I'll try to be very vague. But yeah, these are not the typical run-of-the-mill third-person action-adventure puzzles. You know the ones. You know, the pull this lever here, okay, cool, the grate is moving up, now shoot the thing it exposes, okay, door is open. Or the grab this ball from here and throw it at the thing back there. Wow, puzzle solved. Look, I like Ragnarok and Jedi Survivor as much as the next guy, but I thought these puzzles were kinda lame, not gonna lie. But here, the puzzles have this very escape room style of design, and if you've done an escape room before, you'll know exactly what I mean. You'll come upon things in the world that require you to insert an object, or input a code, or move some dials. You can clearly see the problem. You might think that you can solve it then and there through some trial and error, but you'll likely need to move on for now, holding this puzzle in the back of your mind as you traverse the level. The solution is simple, but you'll need to explore for it. This game strongly encourages you to wander off the beaten path. Search every nook, peek over every ledge. But, you know, the opposite can happen too, where you might just pick up some innocuous object, like a coin, a gear, or maybe you see a sequence of symbols. You don't know what these things mean yet, but you'll be glad that you found them when you happen upon a lock and you've already got the key. The reward is also always worth it. I can't stress this enough, like it's not some consolation prize, like a bit of currency or some upgrade materials. It's often actually impactful pieces of gear. I feel like outside of some exceptions, modern video games have just like rotten my brain. Like if there's no way marker or obvious ping on the radar, or you can't see a big red chest with your X-ray vision, I just assume there's nothing there worth searching for. But on multiple occasions here, we'd solve a puzzle and I'd think to myself, wow, I cannot believe the developers did that. I noticed so many puzzles that required you to think outside the box and look at the environment, like actually really look. I know I'm being vague to avoid ruining anything, but I just really admired the confidence with which Gunfire Games implemented these puzzles. They trust the player's critical thinking will prevail, that they don't need to hold your hand, and you're always appropriately rewarded for your curiosity if you make that extra effort. Some may find these puzzles too contrived, and I kind of get that, but the good news is that a lot of them are totally optional content. I personally found them intriguing enough to chase after. They were very well paced, and honestly they became one of the core reasons for my enjoyment of this game. Those light bulb moments were addicting, and while Gunfire Games are not the first to do this sort of thing, it was certainly a nice surprise. Discovery was clearly one of the core design pillars upon which this game was built, and like the character interactions, it doesn't just deliver on that promise in your first playthrough. It holds up even on subsequent runs because the procedural generation systems here ensure that sense of discovery is reignited with every re-roll. So combat and gunplay in Remnant 2 feels meaty, for lack of a better word. A result of great sound design in combination with how enemies flinch and recoil to your shots. You feel the weight of a body shot as it sends the enemy flying onto their ass. Shooting legs or kneecaps can cause them to trip. A devastating shotgun to the face might blow off their entire upper torso. I didn't experiment a lot with melee here, but the option is there so long as you're prepared to put yourself in harm's way, though I personally found it didn't quite stagger enemies enough to be effective unless you really built into it. Something that took a little getting used to was the dodge roll. It felt sluggish at first, the dodge is slower, you cover less ground, the invincibility window is tighter, but that is by design. Though this game is viewed as a Souls-like, your panic rolling will not work here. You'll need to really study the attack patterns of these enemies, learn to roll to the beat of each swing, as doing otherwise will punish you dearly. In that way, CQC becomes a sort of dance, one that felt very satisfying when you successfully pull it off. However, there is the option later on to be able to upgrade things like your evade distance if you need that sort of safety net. One minor gripe I have is that the sprint felt a little awkward to use mid-combat. It feels like it doesn't move fast enough or that the animation doesn't differ enough from the default run, but I found it hard to tell whether or not I was actually sprinting outside of looking down at the stamina bar. I couldn't see any option in the settings to set sprint as a hold key instead of a toggle either. There are often boss mechanics that are pulling you in or tracking your position, and I just found those mechanics in particular a tad clumsy to contend with due to the sprint being a little weird. The boss fights overall, though, are stellar. Again, I won't show any of the major bosses. Gameplay on screen will just be some of the mini-bosses you might encounter. They're multi-phased fights that take place in these custom-built arenas with epic music thematic to the zone that they reside in. Some of these arenas shift from underneath you. Some have entire stage transitions. There are some boss fights in particular with very creative mechanics, one involving cubes. You'll see what I mean when you get there. I think some mechanics are a little difficult to keep track of when they're being telegraphed off screen, but that happened very rarely and just required a bit more spatial awareness during those encounters. Enemy variety is decent enough. For each faction, you have the standard melee, ranged, flying units, as well as a couple major brute type enemies with special attacks and 3-hit combos. To say that they're just reskinned variants would be reductive though, as each of the factions has their own flavor in how they engage or where their crit spots are located. Some use shields to block upfront damage, some burrow underground, others teleport. You won't encounter any crazy mechanical depth here with these enemies aside from them sort of ducking and weaving your shots, but there's enough diversity here to keep fights interesting right the way through. But for that, you're gonna need a weapon. You have 3 slots, a primary, a secondary, and a melee weapon. There's a vast arsenal at your disposal. This includes old reliables like shotguns, rifles, pistols, and machine guns. Note, this isn't a looter shooter. You aren't going to be picking up new weapons or pieces of armor that's the same thing but with higher stats. You just upgrade the ones that you like to increase their damage. You can attach mods to these guns which give them unique abilities that can be fired off once you've accumulated enough mod power through landing shots. These range from, a healing bomb to flaming tornadoes to concentrated laser beams. There's also more like outlandish weapons with special baked-in mods. These often come from bosses or secret areas. Even if these weapons didn't fit into my build, I was excited to pick these up and give them a spin, just because they all had super unique functionality. Speaking of builds, there are not just mods, good lord no. There are mutations, which can be added to all weapons for further enhancements. Things like aiming down sights to stack up a damage buff, or giving this weapon a chance to refund ammo. These can be leveled up and provide another special bonus at max level. But that's just your weapons. You've also got amulets and rings, and this is where all the real buildcraft happens. Amulets are basically your build-defining item, and then rings are where you really put it all together. You've got 4 slots for them. These contain all sorts of special bonuses. You've got your relic, which is your healing item, and there's many variations of these that you can collect with distinct effects. And you can also slot in these relic fragments for minor stat boosts. There's also trait cards, which allow you to allocate points into health, mod power generation, ability generation, damage reduction, all sorts of things. You start with about half a dozen of these, but like everything else I've mentioned, you'll collect more of them in your playthroughs. And the great thing is, all these slots are available from the get-go. You don't need to reach certain levels to unlock them or something. You can begin to formulate your build right away. You'll just need the components. That's all before I've even mentioned classes. There are 4 class archetypes to start with, each specialized in specific roles. You've got a traditional tank-like class with the Challenger, a healer with the Medic, your ranged assassin with the Hunter, and also the Handler, a sort of all-rounder class with a trusty canine companion. Very handy for solo play. And if none of those classes take your fancy, well, good news. Would you believe me if I told you that there are even more classes that you can unlock? Don't worry, I won't reveal what they are, how many there are, or how to get them. Hopefully you've been able to avoid spoilers, but yeah, how cool is that? Gunfire games have some serious balls to keep entire classes a secret. Just wild. I feel like I've never seen a game do that before. Anyway, on top of everything I've mentioned, you'll unlock the ability to multi-class. This means you can combine the passive perks of 2 archetypes and also select an active ability from each. I built my Hunter to be a complete DPS monkey, stacking every crit multiplier and range damage buff under the sun. I then combined this with the Gunslinger class for maximum ammo efficiency and increased fire rates, as well as this rad ability for quick ad clear. My friend went through multiple builds. At one time, a sort of bruiser, maximizing uptime on shields to proc damage buffs and ensure high sustain. The next, he's a full-on support, using the Medic class with the Handler's Dog in the healer stance, and then boosting his health regen capabilities through items, resulting in our health being constantly topped up all the time. So yeah, as you can imagine, there's so many levers to pull, so much item experimentation and class combinations to explore. I do have a couple grievances though. Number one, there is no list in-game that defines what each of these various buffs or status effects do. You can read them in your inventory screen when they're active, but that doesn't help a lot when you're trying to piece all this together in the menu. Number two, while you can swap around trinkets, weapons, classes, and mods for free at any time, traits are costly to respec, so you're more or less locked into those at the moment, regardless of what your build might favor. Additional classes and consumables are also a little costly to pick up, especially when so many items in the game are competing for your materials. That said, Gunfire have said that they're looking into these economy issues. And number three, you're unlikely to have the necessary pieces for a real build early on, as it mostly picks up in the later game when you've collected way more trinkets. Like Elden Ring, your initial journey through this world isn't predetermined, so you're going to pick up a lot of these bits and bobs that don't necessarily interact with each other in any meaningful way, unless you look up a guide. Your results may vary, of course, but while the rings and amulets I was looting in the early game did provide more power through damage increases or survivability, there wasn't a lot of synergy to play around with for that first 10 hours or so. Even now, 30 hours in, there's a lot of builds I'd like to try out, but I just don't have the right gear, don't know if what I want even exists, or I haven't leveled up the other classes enough to take advantage of them. There's also no loadout system to store these builds, and with how many items there are to manage here, shuffling all of that around every time you want to play a new build does get tiresome. Despite all that though, the prospect of searching for those components to perfect my builds is exciting to think about, and a major incentive to dive back into the game's worlds all over again. In closing this review, I'd like to touch on the difficulty discussion, as I'm sure the Souls-like label will immediately turn off more than a few players. As mentioned at the top, this game has difficulty options. I played on the easiest option, figured this would be the default pick for most people on their first playthrough. Your experience will vary, of course, based on what class you pick, who you play with, what bosses you encounter, etc. But after completing the campaign with one other friend, it didn't feel too difficult. Enemies hit hard, but with aggro split between 2 players, most encounters didn't pose too much of a challenge. Bosses were intense, some we managed to kill by the skin of our teeth, but they only took a few attempts at most, aside from the final boss, who was a total pain in the ass. All this is to say that you shouldn't pass on this if you're concerned about difficulty. You can play the entire game co-op with up to 2 other players. It's all seamless, no weird summoning items required. If you don't have any friends picking this up, then the handler archetype was built specifically with the solo player in mind, so this might be the way to go there. Overall, this is just a damn good video game, especially if you like Souls-like, if you like third-person shooters, or if you're just seeking refuge from the live service hellscape. There are no microtransactions, premium currency, or battle passes anywhere in sight here. It's worth jumping in on the ground floor though, because Gunfire have confirmed that there are 3 DLCs on the way, and if they're anything like what they've produced here in the vanilla game, we're in for a very good time indeed. Remnant 2 is a triumph on almost every level. It's a full-priced game, but worth every penny. This is Gunfire Games' crowning achievement. They should be really proud of themselves for pulling off such an excellent sequel, and I suspect it'll be up there on many Game of the Year lists, despite 2023 already being a fantastic year for video games. So, with all that in mind, I strongly recommend Remnant 2.
Okay, so we've all heard about how this video's sponsor, Expressvpn, can do a bunch of stuff. They let you browse the internet more securely, they let you watch geo-block shows and movies on platforms like Netflix or whatever, but did you know that a VPN is also extremely useful if you play a lot of video games? How, you ask? Well, let's say you want to play Starfield the very second it releases on Xbox. Xbox games release at midnight local time, which means people in New Zealand can play games up to 17 hours earlier than people in the United States. No matter where you are in the world, you can use Expressvpn to trick Xbox Live into thinking that you are in New Zealand. There's a variety of ways to do that through either router or PC settings, and Expressvpn have put together a handy guide that walks you through all of the options step by step. Oh, and there's also one available for PlayStation as well, of course. What about playing games not yet available in your region? Maybe you want to play Blue Protocol right now, which is currently only available in Japan, or maybe you want to play the upcoming Call of Duty Warzone Mobile, which is being rolled out in select territories like Australia at the moment. You can do all of that so easily using Expressvpn's PC or mobile apps. Just boot them up, change your location to the desired region, and boom, you are instantly playing the games you want to be playing right now. If you're someone who likes to download PC mods, then Expressvpn is a very good idea, as some of the mod sites you browse might have a few nasty surprises waiting for you if you aren't careful with what you click on. And there's also DDoS protection in competitive games like CSGO, Valorant, or Tarkov. Expressvpn will mask your IP so that a DDoS attack won't disconnect you at a critical moment. Personally, I use Expressvpn to play games not available in Australia, which is more common than you might think since more than a few games don't hit our shores. It's great because Expressvpn only invests in premium servers. Compared to other really cheap or free VPNs, their speeds are blazing fast, so much so that you won't even realize that you have it on in the background. It just works so seamlessly and you can play with zero lag. So if you want to stay safe online or get early access to games, make sure you check them out in the link in the description box, expressvpn.com/skillup. And if you go there, you'll get 3 extra months of their amazing service for free. Thanks Expressvpn for sponsoring the video, and thank you for watching it.